the universe. Peace and blessings to everyone. I'm Dustin Cron, the founder of the Center for Global Muslim Life, and we're really excited to have my friend, actress, multi-talented martial artist, Hana Rashid, with us from Jakarta, Indonesia tonight. We wanted to start by thanking our sponsors, Penny Appeal. Couldn't have done this without them, and the American Amana Mutual Funds Trust and the American Muslim Community Foundation. It's super important in this moment that we recognize everything that's happening in our world, and our vision for the Center for Global Muslim Life is rooted in Malcolm X's global internationalism and the idea that we can build solidarity with each other and with people around the world. And we also always want to start with a land recognition. Being I'm in San Diego and in the United States to talk about that this is Kumeyaay land, this is indigenous land that I'm on. And it's super important that we recognize these things in these times as we live in a changing world. So we want to bring in our sister Hana. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Yeah, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning to those who are in my region. Good evening to those who are where you are. We're so far.
It is so far. We had the blessing of being together in Jakarta and really talking about the film industry and in Indonesia and the work that you're doing. Of course, we should start with how is everything in Jakarta with everything happening, everything shut down in the film industry. Tell us what's going on there. How are you all holding up?
I mean, alhamdulillah, we're doing okay, but it is quite worrying, to be honest, because obviously, you know, there's a lot of people who work in the industry, a lot of crew who now don't have any income because all productions have shut down, and we're not quite sure when we're going to be able to start up. And obviously, the government we have to kind of take the government's lead on all of the regulations and being able to be out in public with so and so many people. So there's actually, I mean, alhamdulillah, there's been a lot of initiatives to crowdfund and to ask for donations from people so that we can help subsidize the incomes of freelance crew who are working on films, who obviously now are finding themselves in a very difficult position. But I think in these cases where everyone is affected, I think in Indonesia we see such an amazing sense of charity and of generosity, so that everyone does kind of come together to help each other. And that's, mashallah, that's something that is really, really good.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And Indonesia is such an incredible country. Can you talk, of course, Indonesia is known as the largest Muslim majority country in the world, but those of us who've spent time there, obviously you've lived a lot of your life there, know that it's a super complex, diverse society, the largest archipelago in the planet of 1,000+ islands. Can you talk a little bit about the diversity of the film industry, the type of work you see coming out, what excites you about being in the Indonesian film industry?
Wow. I mean, Indonesia is one of those countries where, there's so much diversity. You often feel that with every island you go to, you're in a completely different country, in a completely different place, because the culture is different, the language is different, the food is different. And it's like a mini world on its own, basically. It's super cool. But I think particularly in the film industry, it's super interesting that it's still a growing industry. And I think I think a lot of people have their eyes on Indonesia and on the Asian region in general, but it's really interesting that there are so many filmmakers who in their own right have gone on to kind of represent Indonesia at global audiences, but bringing very distinct stories. Like, for example, you know, you have people like Gareth Evans, like Timo Cahyanto, who have able to kind of really bring Indonesian cinema on the map for the action genre. And then Timo also with the horror genre, and the Mo brothers. And then you have people like Camila Andini, Gary Nugroho, who've gone to so many festivals, bringing really very, very specific ethnic stories within Indonesia, whether they are Javanese or where they are Balinese. And it's something that becomes, I guess it's something that is quite exotic to the Western eye, but it's so interesting that people are able to see Indonesian cinema and then realize how diverse it is. And I think at the moment, I mean, obviously this pandemic happened when there were so many interesting things happening within the local industry. And I'm personally so excited for everything to go back to normal so we can really show you the potential that Indonesian filmmakers have, because the stories offer so much variety. And also, yeah, we're a region that is there are some of our regions that are so remote that even Indonesians don't get the chance to go to those regions or to see those stories. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of representation on TV for those more remote regions. So it's really interesting when filmmakers are able to go to these regions, make amazing stories, and rather it's international film festivals that pick them up. So you guys often have even more luck in seeing what we produce than your everyday Indonesian, to be honest.
Yeah, and there's a lot of Indonesian film content on Netflix right now, and of course, Amazon Prime has it as well. It's almost impossible to find things on there. You have to know the names generally. But if you search Indonesian film on Netflix, at least a long list will come up, including a number of films with Hana, which I know include Buffalo Boys. What's the Aruna and how do you say it?
Aruna dan Lidahnya, or I think the international title is Aruna and Her Palette.
Right. Yeah, and I think a few others also. But let's talk about the film that we were featuring on our website, which, speaking of Gareth Bell, is the short film Pre Vis Action. Can you talk about that film? I love that's one of my favorite shorts of all time, where you get to bring out all of your martial arts skills. Can you talk about how that came together and what that film is?
I mean, it was such a fun random project that happened. Basically, at the time, myself, Kang Cecep, Arif Rahman, and Yayan Rohian, we were all in Jakarta. And obviously, Gareth has now relocated to Wales, and he messaged us saying he'd been kind of challenged to make a pre-vis for a child-friendly, or at least a PG-13 action film. And so it was basically just us messing around in the Welsh forest with that idea of, because everyone's so much aware of Gareth and his crazy skills when it comes to action, and particularly, quite violent action stuff, which I personally really like. But it was so interesting to be able to take on, I guess, the style that he has, but then apply it into a PG-13 concept. And so he came up with this idea of this warrior in the forest who has this extremely important message and has to bring it to somewhere else. And there's these two assassins that come and try and take this message away from her, basically. And it was super fun because it was such an impromptu project. I think I went to London and I got the train where Yayan and Cecep were already there and they had already made the choreography. And literally, I think I arrived in Wales at 7 p.m., arrived 8, started training, and the next morning we were already shooting. So every time we kind of went home, we would practice the next installment and then we would shoot it the next day. And I think it was over I think it was 3 to 5 days that we were doing that. And it was super fun because obviously, I mean, a lot of people commented on the Crocs because obviously, we were just messing about. It was like, we were trying something fun. And the three of us, although I was raised in the UK, I'm no longer used to the UK climate. So I think it was October. So it was already really cold in Wales, mud everywhere, rain. So we even had wetsuits under our costumes, actually, because we were so freezing and it was so difficult to move when you're feeling that cold. So yeah, that was really funny. And obviously, we had play swords. You could see they were wobbling and bending all over the place. But it was so funny because there are a few people who came through this wooded area where we were fighting. And some of them were like, "Oh, this is really interesting. What are you guys doing?" Like, "Oh, we're just shooting a short film." And they're like, "Okay." And then there was another guy who got really threatened and called the police on us, it was just really funny. And then obviously when the police turned up, they're like, "These are very clearly plastic samurai swords. Okay, you guys are good. Don't worry about it." But yeah, it was super fun. And it was really interesting to be able to explore, again, this action for a younger audience. So how could we give them the same intensity, the same excitement of seeing this action film, but without the blood and without, mostly without the blood, but also, just trying to explore something. So that was really fun. And it was really cool to see the reaction. Actually, we weren't expecting people to love it that much because we were just messing about in the forest, basically.
Yeah, to start a change.org petition for that to become a feature-length film.
Yeah.
Come on, where is it at? We'd love to see you as a star in a film about. I want to know more about your character in that film.
Yeah.
Yeah, so but let's talk about that. With you, such incredible, skills in that film. So talk about your roots in Silat, and of course, I'm friends with your brother. That's how we met. And your family's history in Silat and this background. Can you talk a little bit about your family and how you trained in martial arts?
So basically, my father is Bugis. Bugis is one of the ethnic groups of Indonesia, from East Indonesia, from South Sulawesi. And when he moved over to London as a student, he actually opened the first Pencaksilat class in the UK. And I mean, he'd grown up doing the martial art. And I think with a lot of people that grew up in Southeast Asia, whether it's in Malaysia, Singapore, or Indonesia, especially for a lot of Muslim communities, Silat is very much a big part of the community and of their kind of daily lives. Even in places like Sumatra, you have these things where Silat and Salah is so much integrated, where you go to the madrasa, you go to the pesantren, we call it, where you pray and you read the Quran, and then you're going straight into the pendopo where you're doing your Silat training. So yeah, my father basically brought that to the UK. And being his daughter, I grew up seeing my dad teaching people this martial art. And then I grew up watching films like Jackie Chan and thinking, oh my God, is my dad like a superhero? I was like, my dad like Jackie Chan or something? Just like seeing my dad like just doing fly kicks everywhere. And I think I was always attracted to martial arts because of him. And then I only started to take it really seriously when I was 16, actually. And then I started training, and then along with my brother, who was my coach. And then I represented the UK at various competitions. And yeah, it was something that for me, Silat has always been, it was never just a hobby. And it was also never just something that I was kind of as a byproduct born into, but genuinely the culture and the values surrounding Pencaksilat for me is something amazing. And I've seen directly how it can impact people's lives, the sense of sportsmanship, the sense of that brotherhood, the sense of discipline and respect that you show to your opponent. Even in the ring, there's a very specific etiquette that you show people. You walk into a ring and you hormat, you salam, and then I find there's so many values within it that have shaped my life and continue to shape my life now. And I've also seen it when I was still living in London. We would actually teach at some schools in the UK. And I remember we taught at a school in South London, that there was a lot of kids who kind of came from difficult backgrounds and lived in difficult areas. And you could see that they had like a lot of pent up anger and aggression. And it was so amazing to see them when we first met them to when they started to train and started to have that discipline instilled in them. Like, the change was amazing. And this is actually something that I remember my father, after the tsunami in Aceh, he went to Aceh and he did a lot of charity work there, but he opened up a branch of our Silat school there. And, Aceh at the time of the tsunami was still going through a conflict between separatists and between pro-Indonesian communities. And there was children who had grown up as orphans because either their parents had been killed by the Indonesian army, or they'd been killed by separatists. And now the tsunami kind of wiped everything clean, and they're all there together, but they've grown up with these we're on opposite sides kind of notions. And when my father made this Silat school there, he noticed that this was the way of bringing people together who had been on completely different sides, but there's this solidarity and this brotherhood that you get from training together. And again, Aceh being also a quite conservative Muslim province in Indonesia, it's not only you trade together, but you also do your prayers together, you do your salah together. And everyone kind of came together in it, and it was something that was quite beautiful to see. And it's something that I totally believe that through sports and through this kind of stuff, you can bring people who are completely different sides, but then you come together for this one purpose and this one goal. And it's beautiful. And I still believe that today, that Pencak Silat is a sport that unites people. It's a sport that instills really good values within those that practice it. And I've seen firsthand how they continue to be the best pesilat in their day-to-day lives. Even if they're not training, they still maintain those values. And that's something that is super, super cool.
That's a really beautiful story about your father. Thank you for sharing that. And then what about this? And this, it also has deep spiritual aspects as well, right? The practice of Silat. Can you talk a little bit about that? Or just you think it's a way to bring people together primarily, or is it hard to talk about the spiritual components?
I think it's difficult to talk about the spiritual components, because I think that it's something that is so unique to the Southeast Asian region, and therefore it's not necessarily something that a lot of people who aren't from the region will understand. But then again, you know, growing up in London and doing Silat in London, we also noticed that because a lot of British people had heard about the spiritual aspect, it's kind of like, oh, we want to come and train so we can do all this crazy spiritual stuff. And I think, you know, even that level of attainment comes from a very, very strict, you know, you have to be dedicated to the very basics first. And I think in a lot of times, especially when I've seen with my father, the spiritual aspect is not something that comes instantly. It's something that is developed through years. And I think particularly when you have a guru or you have a pendekar, how we say, it's something that it also isn't revealed to everyone, because I think it is so special. And it's something that you have to earn. And, you know, there are so many stories throughout the history of Southeast Asia of you know, warriors using this kind of spiritual aspect of Silat to do really quite miraculous or crazy things that a lot of people perhaps in the West would not believe. But it's so ingrained in Indonesian culture particularly. But taking it now into like the kind of a more modern context and a more modern world makes it, I think, even more difficult to talk about somehow. And I think also it's, you know, it's so ingrained in this extremely traditional way of life. And I think in this sense, I mean, even Silat as a sport, it's something that even within Indonesia, it's something that is still very much like on a village level. It's practiced very much on a village level where it's very much integrated with other aspects of life. And unfortunately, what that means is that when you go into more modern spheres or modern communities, or like in the big cities, it's not necessarily a sport that is as popular as, you know, your jujitsus or your karates or your taekwondos that have come from other places, because the way in which that it's trained, it's something that it is kind of like a lifetime commitment. And I think I really hope that Silat will have more of a revival within Indonesia itself, because it's definitely doing so well abroad. And I think that's because of this mystic culture that comes with it, which is so different to a lot of other martial arts.
Yeah, and then the main person, kind of one of the people globalizing right now, of course, is Iko Uwais. I know he has a new series, Wu Assassins, that's on Netflix that I'm excited to watch. But I think that's for reference for people, that's kind of, he fights in a style that is Silat, or no?
Oh, sorry, you've broken off there.
Can you hear me?
Hello, yeah, I can hear you now.
No, I was saying that Iko Uwais fights in that style for people to know in terms of a reference. He's probably one of the biggest global Muslim martial artists right now, celebrities, correct? Like that, you trained with him at some point, correct?
Sorry?
with Equal Oasis.
Oh yeah, so his team were basically the choreography team for The Night Comes for Us, the film that we did for Netflix. And
Right.
I think this is what's also interesting when it comes to action that comes out of Indonesia. It does have a very specific look compared to other action films that are made. And that is because it's rooted, the people that have kind of started this or kind of made this genre big internationally is because they did do Pencak Silat originally. And therefore, that's the martial art that they kind of bring into a lot of the choreography that they do. Although now I think that there are a lot of action films being made in Indonesia where they're trying to not necessarily move away from Silat, but I think Silat, like if you do Silat, it's very much such a traditional martial art that when you're creating stories, it's also it's how do I put this? So if like you're writing a script about a particular character, if they do Pencak Silat, it says so much about where they're from, or the class that they're from, or what region they're from. And therefore, I think a lot of Indonesian filmmakers, when they're now trying to make stories that are more universal, Silat will not necessarily be the first option because it is so unique and because it has such an identity with particular regions and all that kind of stuff. So there's the base that is Silat, but then I think they try to make it more MMA, more mixed martial arts. Especially, there's actually a brilliant film that was made a few years ago called Gundala, and Gundala is made by Joko Anwar, and it's basically one of the first Indonesian superhero movies, and it's actually based on these comics that we've had here since the 50s or since the 60s, and Gundala was made, and obviously because he's a superhero, you also have to adapt the action to that, and the fact that, and his background and all that kind of stuff, and because he has these superpowers that are drawn from lightning, it's the choreography will also have to be adapted. And so there's a lot of Silat influences, but even within that, Iko Uwais is from a particular school of Silat. Yayan Ruhian is from another different school of Silat, and Cecep is from Panglipur, which is completely different. So even within the Silat world, you have different styles and you have different schools that are very visibly different.
That's super interesting. But let's go back into the general Indonesian film world, because I think again this idea that it's all we hear in the West, Muslim majority country, but if you look at the content, I don't see a ton of like quote Islamic films, right? I think that talk about, especially you work in action, you work in the horror genre, and the horror genre is actually really popular in Indonesia. Can you talk about the types of films being made and what's popular in Indonesia right now?
So I mean, there are so many genres being made. Horror has always been a favorite for the nation. I think it's because we have quite a dark and violent history, but we also have this culture that is steeped in mysticism. So I think when it comes to local ghosts and all that kind of stuff, people are like super obsessed and they believe in that kind of stuff. Even today, they will believe in this. Pardon me. And so I think that's why horror is so we like scaring ourselves. I don't know why, but we love it, and we're able to do so. It's not just like, for example, I think in the US, you have like ghosts, people who have passed and who now come back, whereas in Indonesia, you have so many different kinds of ghosts and monsters and urban legends that everyone believes in, and therefore you're really able to kind of hone in on that. And particularly last year, we released a film called Ratu Ilmu Hitam, which is the international title is Black Magic Woman, which was actually it's a remake of a cult classic that actually did super well internationally in the 80s. And we did a remake of this film, and we were actually exploring ways in which we could scare the Indonesian audience in different ways, not necessarily through ghosts or jump scares, but exploring people's fears. And we had a lot of like creepy crawlies, and we we also explore this idea of santet, and santet is a type of black magic. And that is also something that is still very much done here, or at least believed in here, where, you know, if people want to take revenge on others, they will do it through santet. And, you know, whether it's either attacking their loved ones, or suddenly they'll be puking nails, and there's all sorts of crazy stuff that is still so entrenched in the local culture. But apart from that, I mean, to be honest, there are a lot of films here that are that have a religious theme. There are a lot, and they do commercially extremely well. But if I'm perfectly honest, I find them to be quite problematic, because I think that they buy into this very conservative narrative, in the sense that a lot of these films, in the way that they are written and the way that they are shot, they end up not celebrating the diversity of the Muslim community, in the sense that there's a lot of things that are kind of, I feel like there's a lot of propaganda put into these films, where, for example, a lot of them end up having narratives that are extremely pro-polygamy, that you can only be a good Muslim woman if you if you kind of allow your husband to get another wife, or if you convert to Islam, or if you have if you will wear a hijab, and if you stay at home. And there's all these kind of values that I think they put into their films, which I personally find quite problematic, because I think, you know, there are so many ways to be Muslim, and there are so many ways for you to identify with your religion. And I think when you have these films that end up being extremely popular, even, I mean, we've seen Indonesian society now, I think over the past 10 years, has become a lot more conservative and has become a lot more intolerant to the diversity that we've had previously. And sometimes I wonder whether or not these extremely commercially successful religious films have played a part in that, because they perpetuate particular narratives, politically, Islam has also been politicized in this country. And I think that I'm quite glad that you guys are not able to see those films, to be honest. I'm quite happy that international audiences want to see other stuff from Indonesia, because for me personally, I find those films quite problematic. But apart from that, we have a lot of stories, again, like I said, that come from very particular regions, or deal with very particular issues. And a lot of the time, again, within the kind of conservative Muslim way that we are leading politically in this country, there are a lot of films that are actually, there's a lot of censorship that happens within Indonesian films, and there's a lot of repression of the creativity of Indonesian filmmakers. Last year, Garin Nugroho made the most beautiful film, Kucumbu Tumbu Indaku, and it's about the transgender communities, or it's about it looks at kind of the LGBTQ community within Java, where this idea of men being dancers and dressing up as women is something that has happened within the culture for centuries. And he did this amazing story highlighting this aspect of Javanese culture that has been around for so long, but it caused quite a lot of controversy, and there were a lot of people who were lobbying for it to be taken down, and for it not to be shown in cinemas. And there was even the case where there was a film that did very, very well last year called Two Blue Lines, and it's basically about a teenage couple who ended up having an unwanted pregnancy, and seeing it how their respective families deal with this issue. And obviously, this is something that happens a lot in Indonesia. We also have one of the highest rates of child marriages globally. So even from the trailer alone, there was this petition to shut down the film. And it was so interesting that when it came out, people absolutely loved it. because obviously they only judged it from, oh, it's quite scandalous, there's this young girl and she's gotten pregnant and she's not married. But what they did is they jumped the gun. They didn't even wait to watch the film before they protested it. And when the film came out, obviously it showed the complexities of being within a Muslim family and this happening. And, you know, it also highlighted the lack of sexual reproductive health education that we have in this country that leads to a lot of unwanted pregnancies, and that leads to a lot of child marriage. And then that leads to a lot of, you know, divorce and abuse and all this kind of stuff. So it's so interesting that there's a lot of self-censorship happening within the industry because of this conservative narrative. Like, if you make particular scenes, or if you say particular things, you can get censored, and therefore, or not even censored, your rating can be pushed up, which means automatically, you know, you're going to be losing a huge chunk of the audience, and that affects your business. So it's really quite interesting to see how much kind of the political religious narrative has also affected the film industry.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we've been thinking about here within this film festival is what even is global Muslim film? What is this as an idea? You can't just, like a lot of these shows, the ones I've seen at least, the TV shows from Malaysia that are on Netflix, that are produced, that are funded by the government. You're right, they have a very specific agenda, and a lot of them have to do with the men wife to take all of the women who are interested in them. That's the general story, right? And they're on Netflix. But what we've, you know, to me, there's about 4 types of Muslim film that we've looked at so far. Muslims in film, the first being, of course, the Islamophobic content, which in the West is the most well-funded. Then you have like Muslims as kind of liberal, westernized characters, which generally also can get funding and can get distribution. And then there's like media produced by Muslims that shows the more complex stories. And I would say even a show like Rami is an example of that, where the second season was actually released for Eid, basically, to the US market. And so they're seeing the market of Muslims and why it's necessary. You have Marshala Ali, who plays a really, really beautiful spiritual character in that. He plays a sheikh, and he plays it very beautifully in the show. But then there's films that are actually about spirituality and transformation. To me, some of my favorite films that we really see, and I would say a great example of that would be like Spike Lee's Malcolm X. Right, it's probably one of the greatest examples of spirituality in film, a 3-hour story of transformation. So do you see, and not only that, but a film that obviously should have won, you know, best film that year, and it didn't. I think it was the same year that Schindler's List came out. But anyway, do you see spiritual film work that's coming out within Indonesia that's more maybe art house, but represents this real beautiful stories about the community?
I think it's extremely minimal, because I think a lot of the big studios here have realized that being, you know, a Muslim majority country, Islam becomes a commodity when it comes to film. So how can we make, like, because there's so many commercial films that, like, we call them here religious films, but for me they lack all sense of spirituality. It's again just pushing these kind of very specific ways to be a Muslim, which don't represent every kind of Muslim community or Muslim person. But there are some that do deal with this sense of spirituality. And I think one that was brilliant was actually a film that an Indonesian filmmaker called Ismail Basbeth, he made a film called Mencari Hilal. And it reminded me of, there's a film called Le Grand Voyage, where it's a father-son duo, I think, who leave from France, and they do the road trip to go to Mecca. And it reminded me a lot of that, because it's this father who's trying to, I can't remember if he's trying to go back for some sort of pilgrimage or something like that within Java, but the whole film is looking about the relationship of him and his son. And it was beautiful, and it was one of those films where I think that's what you would call a spiritual film, and that's the kind of film that makes you think about Islam from different perspectives, and it's on an extremely personal level. And to be honest, I wish there would be more of those films that made us think, as opposed to kind of being force-fed very obvious populist political narratives that we do have. But we have a lot of those spiritual films that actually come from other ethnic groups, which are perhaps linked to other religions. Like there's for example, if you look at the film The Seen and the Unseen by Camilla Andini that did extremely well abroad, it looked at Balinese culture, and it looked at the significance of the afterlife for the Balinese, and that was beautiful. But it wasn't it wasn't a Muslim spiritual film. It was of a different ethnic group and a different religion.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the hard part. You have to be talented enough to really get the sense of spirituality within your film. So we've talked about like Majid Majidi, the great Iranian master, as an example, who's making, like, he has a beautiful film called The Willow Tree that's about a professor who writes Sufi poetry, and he's blind, and then he gets his sight back and he loses his whole life and he loses his whole mind. And this idea of the over visualization of our world and all these spiritual sense. But I think we see less of that, and hopefully, like, that's what we're trying to encourage here as well. How do we make film that's beautiful, that moves people? And that there's another film in the US called Jinn by Nigel Moomin. I don't know if you thought it's not about jinn, as the Indonesians might like. It's about African-American mother and daughter who both convert to Islam, but then it shows the difficult journey of conversion, right? If I were to tell a story about my conversion and I made it into a film, a lot of Muslims are not like it, because you have to deal with, it's not like we came a lot of us from difficult situations, and our lives were transformed. That doesn't mean that we became, we're super Muslims. We have to be real within our storytelling.
I think particularly in the Indonesian context, what has to be considered is the fact that getting funding for films is extremely difficult anyway. And so because now there is also this idea of self-censorship, because there's so much political / popular narrative about how you should be as a proper Muslim or a proper person and all this kind of stuff. You know, there's growing anti-LGBTQ sentiment, there's growing intolerance, not only, of other ethnic groups, all this kind of stuff. So I believe that the stories of all people should be heard. And I think what I love about film is it's through film that we can learn more about other people, and we can at least, listen and see. We can form our own opinions after that, but at least we're able to see, and we don't remain ignorant, and we show compassion above all to everyone. And so I think that in Indonesia particularly, it's difficult because, you have to remember that distribution here is extremely limited. So the system in which it runs at the moment, the distribution channels that we have here, particularly cinemas, they're not necessarily in favor of local content. So what we have here is whenever we're promoting a film, we always have to remind people, watch the film in the first few days. Because what happens in Indonesia is if the local films come out on a Thursday, and if by the weekend the numbers aren't great, they'll take the film out and they'll put something else. And a lot of the time it's, films from abroad that get more, that are given more time because they make more money. So I would love for our system to be more like a South Korean system, where the government intervened to really make sure that local films were prioritized, to be able to create that ecosystem where the industry is self-sufficient and it does well, and where local films do well. And if we look at South Korean cinema now, I mean, the Oscars, best film, do you know what I mean? So here, I think we need that intervention from the government, because it's already difficult to get funding for films in general, and it's already difficult for you to make money in this industry. And then when you start doing stories that are a bit more niche, it becomes even more difficult. So I think, and I do find that a lot of filmmakers, they don't want to be constrained by the kind of the narrative that we have at the moment. Because if you do a film that is, you know, about a woman who marries someone and then he marries someone else, that'll get funding straight away, because they think, oh, this is what Islam is. Oh, and it's interesting that a lot of these producers who are making these films that are, for example, pro polygamy and all this kind of stuff, they're not even Muslim. They're actually from other religions, but they see that Islam is a commodity in the film industry. It does well. But then again, for me, I feel there's a danger in what you put out there that represents Islam. And so I would love to see more spiritual films. I would love to see more films that look at personal journeys of faith, except that in Indonesia, automatically, we say nggak laku, which means it doesn't sell. And that's really, really unfortunate. And I think that's why so many of our great filmmakers look to outside festivals to get funding or pitching elsewhere, because it's so difficult to get funding here. And even a lot of people kind of, they go to festivals and they try to sell their films there. So they know that if I make this film, I know that I'll be covered from revenue that I'll get from outside of Indonesia. And if it shows in Indonesia or it doesn't, then it's not the be all and end all. And I think it's a shame that our own ecosystem does not support everyone. But I would love to see every film that you've just mentioned. I'm like, okay, I need to make a list. I need to watch all of these films and get them somehow.
Right, but even from a governmental perspective, like what South Korea has done, like you said, is such an amazing model where the entertainment industry is literally at the center of their economy. It's tens of billions of dollars that they're generating by supporting real talent. And Indonesia has some of the most talented filmmakers I've met, and deserves that. So I agree with you. But I think, as we know, as my country would tell us, everything is about what administration you have in power and if they actually want to support the people or not. So let's go deeper, right? Because about this self-censorship piece, because you're, mashallah, super fierce activist for people who don't know. And in certain circles, that got you attacked. So can you talk a little bit about some of the campaign that happened against you? And of course, people know in the US context, we had these Russian bots and all these things that impacted these they were literally posing as fake Muslims and fake, African Americans and all these different things to impact the 2016 election. You had Islamic bots attacking you on the internet. Can you talk about this?
I mean, basically, so I'm like, I wouldn't call myself an activist, but I'm an advocate for women's issues in Indonesia. And I think what we've seen is that the more women talk about things that relate to them and the more that they stand up for themselves, and then the more they do not accept the patriarchal culture that we have been raised in, that has been detrimental to a lot of women in the country, the status quo doesn't like it, and the status quo doesn't agree. And therefore I think now the kind of global trend is whenever someone is saying something and you don't agree with it, especially as, like the kind of, whether it's the regime or whether it's the kind of the majority opinion, it's how do we silence these people? And now, of course, technology is being used to silence people. And it's these bots, and it's being hounded by thousands of accounts. And it's like, my picture was spread on a lot of like radical sites, and they were inciting people to attack me online. And my accounts, someone tries to hack into my accounts and all of this kind of stuff. And this is basically because I went to the Women's March and I made a poster, and what I said on my poster, I thought was really clever, but obviously they didn't agree. Maybe because so basically what I had written on my poster was, my aurat is none of your business. Stop victim blaming. Stop sexual harassment. Because here there is so much so this narrative that that it's a woman's fault if she's harassed because of what she's wearing. And obviously we know so much with research that has been done that there's no correlation whatsoever. And therefore, I tried so much to raise this issue in a way that I thought would be impactful. And in the end, it just got me loads of hate. And I think, I mean, what it taught me was to advocate smarter and to be very much aware that there are a lot of people who are trying to silence you, and they want you to stay quiet because they feel threatened. And I've decided that I don't want to stay quiet. That's what they want. And it wasn't just me. It was hundreds of people that are experiencing this now. And there's actual, there are specific groups that are targeting us. And even up until today, there are two independent media outlets who focus on women's issues, who have been hacked, who have been hounded by bots, and who now currently are not able to access their website or their accounts. And the recent articles that they've put up suddenly disappear. Like, there is like a very real attack on women who are speaking up. And I find that quite sinister. And yeah, I think if anything, it makes us want to speak up even more. And it makes us, I don't want to back down, because I truly believe that the status quo does not benefit women. It does not help us in any way, for women to be treated as second-class citizens, for people to make excuses for the actions of men and the patriarchy. So yeah, it's extremely difficult. And even throughout my career, I've even had brands who've been drawn away from me because I'm too political. And it's quite interesting that, I mean, that incident happened, I think, 3 years ago now. And it's so interesting that, over time, and especially, we're also quite influenced by what we see globally. And I think America is, one of those places where a lot of kind of civil rights stuff happens very quickly, and then it kind of goes everywhere. I mean, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement that is currently happening now, we're having the conversation here in Indonesia about Papuan lives and about how, there's also systemic racism here, and maybe it's something that's been brushed under the carpet for so long. But I think when we see these global movements for good, it reassures us, and we know that we just have to keep fighting, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really amazing. Can you talk a little bit more about, because there's this big global conversation around race and anti-Blackness, and of course you're talking about Papua New Guinea, that some people consider to be colonized by Indonesia, correct? And so could you talk about more, what is that conversation that's now started in Indonesia from the moment that we're living in and this movement of Black Lives Matter in the US?
I think it was very correctly brought up that a lot of people were supporting and were posting about Black Lives Matter and supporting the movement, in solidarity with everyone in the US. And I think a lot of Indonesians who are aware of what's happening in Papua very quickly said, well, why are you talking about America? Look at yourself. And I think it made everyone start to think. But, it's extremely difficult to talk about Papua in Indonesia, because there's so much information that is not accessible to a lot of us on the subject. And there's a very clear state agenda when it comes to Papua, and the narrative is very much controlled by the state. But it's difficult to talk about, if I'm perfectly honest, because when you talk about Papua, the debate ends up being also about separatism and about, a referendum for independence. And for people who are so nationalistic as Indonesian, it becomes an extremely sore point, and it's very difficult to talk about it. But what we're seeing is, again, people who try to speak up about it or try to raise awareness on the subject are being shut down. And I've even experienced this in the past week, where there was a discussion that was held by a Papuan activist and human rights lawyer with two Papuan men who are obviously a part of the movement. And I just promoted it, and I watched this discussion because I thought, at this point, if I don't know anything and if I'm ignorant, well, then what I should do is listen and just make up my own mind, but most definitely listen. And just as a result from promoting that and doing a very quick summary. A lot of people are like, oh, how can we help? How can we help the Black Lives Matter movement? How can we help our brothers in Papua? And, they gave a list of, this is how you can help. Listen, and don't speak for us. We need to have our own voices heard. And if you want to find any information, this is where you can get it. And I posted this and it went viral, and instantly people are saying, oh, I'm pro-separatist and I'm pro-Papuan independence and I know nothing. And there's very real threats from, state bodies, and it's quite scary. And it kind of shows that, well, no one has been having this conversation because they're afraid to, and that fear is extremely real. But I think what we can look at for sure is if we don't want to get too into the nitty gritty, we can at least look at racism, and we can look at how we look at Black people within our own country, how we look at the Melanesians in Indonesia, and this is perpetuated through the media. If we look at whitening creams and standards of beauty, or what it means to be beautiful, and what is it to be acceptable, and who looks threatening, and you can very clearly see what's happening in America, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Britain. The same thing happens here. And I think what's interesting is there's been a lot of discussions now happening in the South Asian community, within the Arab community, within the Indonesian community, on how we do treat our brothers who are of darker skin tones. And it's a discussion that very much needs to happen.
Yeah, and then like you said, the deep part of it as well is the internalized white supremacy. Yeah. What white supremacy has done to people around the world. I remember when I was in Indonesia, I loved to look at all the what's out here, the products and stuff like that, and we find halal skin whitening cream.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. How in the world could the idea of skin lightening even be considered to be halal? Exactly. in the first place, and a religious body is going to put their stamp on that, say that it's okay, and then people do it. Now, obviously, we see that in film industries as a perfect example as well, based on who gets what roles and who doesn't get roles, and these types of things based on skin color as well. So we have to have a big global conversation about race right now, and it's beautiful to see that you all are doing it. But related to that, I wanted to, talk quickly. We wanted to shout out one of your favorite books. Can you talk about, this book I feel like foundationally is a decolonial book, and it very much deals with these issues in the history of Indonesia if people want to learn more.
So if anyone wants to learn more about, the history of Indonesia, particularly the colonization under the Dutch, then one writer you should really look into is Pramudia Anantatur, or Pram as we like to call him. And basically, Pram was a political prisoner in Indonesia, and he was considered a communist just because he was part of this kind of leftist writing publication. But he was imprisoned for decades, and he was thrown to the eastern part of Indonesia on a remote island where he was forced to do, forced labor and all sorts. He didn't have access to his books. His entire collections were burnt. And then, I can't remember how many decades it was, but then he was released, and then nothing really happened after that. But his books were banned for so long. And this book, This Earth of Mankind, I think it's one of the most important books in Indonesia because, for me personally, my father introduced me to it when I was 14 years old. And he said to me, he was like, if you want to know about your country, read this book. And I read it and I cried. And it was the first time I felt Indonesian. It was the first time I felt proud of being Indonesian. And it looks at, actually, it's based on this character, this Javanese boy. So this native boy who's actually comes from a family of status within Javanese culture. And he goes to a Dutch school. And, he's constantly berated because of the color of his skin, but he's extremely educated. He speaks Dutch. And then one day he meets this family who are this extremely unconventional family of a concubine, a native concubine, Nyai Antosoro, who lives and runs this business with a Dutch man. And they have children, and the main character ends up falling in love with her daughter. And it's this whole idea of identity, and its whole idea of injustice, that even even the woman that he falls in love with being mixed race. And I think why I identified so much with this book is there's so many complexities to being of mixed race, particularly during the colonial period, where your mother as a native has no status whatsoever, and your father, if he chooses to acknowledge you or not, like your status is dependent on that. And obviously this main character being exposed to this, he starts to learn a lot more about his own identity and his own race and his own place within the Indonesian independence movement. And it's the most amazing book. And it's actually Pram, when he was in prison as a political prisoner, he would retell this book to prisoners because he didn't have access to writing tools. And he wrote 4 books, and that's why they call it the Buru Quartet, because he was on the island of Buru. And yeah, it's amazing. And it's something that you guys should definitely look into and read. The book was banned in Indonesia for years. And yeah, now it's readily available. But yeah, it's a super, super important book. And if you guys are interested, there's Pramudia, there's also Mokhtar Lubis is another writer who looks into the idea of colonialism, but also post-independence Indonesian politics, and it's super, super interesting.
Yeah, and I compared it, when I read it, it reminded me of Sheikh Ahmadou Kane's book about Senegal, Ambiguous Adventure, which is about this first generation of colonization, when this young boy, he's the first person in his family to go to the French school instead of going to the Quran school. And Prom goes even deeper across 4 novels and really goes from who he is as a boy, then all the way up to him starting based on a real character, right? Who starts the first Javanese language, I believe, newspaper, and then leads towards revolution and all these things. So mashallah. But of course, as we close out, we wanted you to also mention. Can you talk a little bit about your activism with women around Indonesia and any place where people can find your work or what you're supporting right now?
So, I mean, at the moment, what we're trying to do is because of this pandemic, obviously there are a lot of vulnerable women because of Corona now. It's really unfortunate that globally the amount of domestic violence cases is now increasing because, I mean, if you can imagine, there are women who are in nightmare situations who now have to live with their abuser, and a lot of government safe houses have been closed. So we've been trying to raise money for a lot of women who are being affected. Not only them, but, in Indonesia, I'm sure when you were here, you took an ojek, like the motorbike taxis. So we have a lot of, transportation, what's the word? We have a lot of transportation options that are extremely close contact because, they're on the back of motorcycles. And there are a lot of women who work in these industries and they are no longer able to. So we've also trying to be raise money to supplement the incomes of these women who now find themselves, single parent families and no longer having any income. But what I've been trying to do here in Indonesia is basically talk about issues that also have affected me personally, because I think whatever you advocate for, it has to come from a place of experience and a place of authenticity. I mean, if you don't have the experience, but you at least genuinely empathetically feel that, you understand and you want to be involved. And for me, unfortunately, gender-based discrimination and gender-based violence is something that I've experienced, and I experienced even more so when I moved to Indonesia. And whether that's having been in an abusive relationship or whether it's having been harassed or catcalled on the street, and all sorts of stuff. And it's something that is extremely prevalent here because no one talks about it. So what I've been trying to do through my advocacy is to talk about it and to publicly put out my personal experiences, particularly so women out there know that they're not alone, and trying to have conversations with men or male friends so that they understand from a woman's perspective, because that's what's very much missing is when you don't have, and this is something that we see in the film industry as well, because we don't have a lot of film directors or writers who are women, female narratives tend to get lost. And I think this is something that you know, even in Hollywood, it's been talked about years ago, and I think things are starting to get better. And we, you know, kind of are behind you guys by a few years, and now that's kind of something that is starting to happen. So another thing that I'm currently focusing on now is Indonesia hasn't necessarily had its Me Too movement or moment, but there are some of us, particularly actresses, who are starting to speak up about instances of harassment that we have experienced on sets. And currently, I'm trying to speak to directors, producers, other actresses to make sure that even in this state of Corona, where everyone is trying to think about how we can move forward and start back production safely from this virus, we want to remind them that, you know, your sets haven't been safe for years because of sexual predators and because of toxic culture and bullying. And don't forget, this is something that we also want to feel safe from. So I'm currently talking to a lot of producers and filmmakers to see how they can make changes within their own productions to make women feel safe, to make us know that there is at least a support system or a place in which we can report instances of harassment, whether, you know, we have sexual harassment clauses in contracts that can be made the standard. And yeah, we're basically committing to try and make the film industry safer for everyone, because we love making films, we love working, and we're tired of not feeling comfortable. And this is something that, especially moving forward post-pandemic, we want to change.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that, you know, we should all reflect upon the difference we see when you see a film that's made, written by women, right? And so we started the festival with the Yasmin Ahmed film. We talked about Yasmin Ahmed work as an example, who, like you said, she's legendary in the region. We need more women behind the camera. We need more women directors, producers, you know, executives, etc. So that's a really amazing work. And there was a sister who had a comment saying, thank you for sharing your work and the resources. She's a Canadian Muslim convert in Indonesia. She's noticed the conservatism and its views about anti-oppression and women's issues.
Oh, bless. Thank you very much, Melissa. Yeah, it's so important, because I mean, this is the thing, right? Maybe I come from a place of privilege because I wasn't born in Indonesia. I was born in the UK. I was born in London and I grew up there, and then I came here. So a lot of the perspective that I have obviously comes from having, you know, a British education and being born there. But it's because I moved here that I started to open my eyes more to this issue. And it's here that I experienced gender-based discrimination and harassment. And you know, along the journey, I kind of noticed that people don't talk about it. And then because they don't talk about it, it means that victims can't get help. And because we don't talk about it, it means that, you know, men continue to act like this, and it's not appropriate. And particularly for me, it's un-Islamic. It's completely un-Islamic for you to treat people like this or to treat women like this. And then it becomes extremely interesting when we speak up about this. It's rather conservative Muslims who are against us and who are trying to shut us down and to silence us. And for me, I always find that really, it's quite difficult, because if you look at Islam, there's so much about, you know, gender equality and about respect and compassion to people. And these actions don't reflect that, but the religion does. And it's how can we go back onto the right path? Not that I'm necessarily always on it, but how can we always go back to being, you know, show, you know, compassion to people and yeah, just treat them nicely. It's so basic.
Well, it sounds like a reckoning is coming to the Indonesian film industry, and we pray for you and all of your work and your continued activism and your film work. And so definitely have to gather a film list from this conversation and for everyone as well. Are there any other films you wanted to shout out people should be watching, or that you've been watching while you've been home?
I mean, if you have access to Netflix or Amazon Prime or even on Apple, I think there's so many great Indonesian films that are out there. You can start with, I mean, if you're into action, The Night Comes for Us, please watch our film. It's super cool. And then for horror, Satan's Slaves is amazing. May the Devil Take You is also really, really good, and it shows you a really good idea of how Indonesians see horror and see mysticism and all that kind of stuff. Arun and Her Palette is a really fun road movie. It's very light. You're going to see some amazing Indonesian food in it that'll get you really, really hungry. And then there's a really great film, which I hope you guys have on Netflix, called The Dancer. It's also another film that looks at this idea of this Javanese culture of the Rongen dancer. And it's super, super interesting. But yeah, please Google if needed. If you guys want to see which Indonesian films are kind of doing critically really well, you can always check out Festival Film Indonesia, and then you can see what's been nominated in that festival, because that's like the Oscars of Indonesia. So if you want a reference on films that have done really well critically, then please check Festival Film Indonesia.
Awesome, beautiful. And you can find Hannah on Instagram and all over the place, on Twitter, I think, as well. Yeah, and thank you again for the conversation. We hope to.
So much.
Yeah, well, inshallah, we can do it again next year with a bigger crew and have a big conversation. But, yeah, but thank you all for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.